Thank you, everybody, for the opportunity to engage in this very important discussion, which I believe really transcends any kinds of boundaries, geographic or otherwise. I appreciate the opportunity very much, and I think we need to be engaging in such discourse across party lines, across, as I said, oceans, and any other kind of boundaries. And indeed, I think that the way that the conversation was framed this evening in the imperative to balance free speech and what is hate speech, in this case anti-Semitism, is really the challenge that we have as lawyers, as jurists, as academicians. Indeed, from my own doctoral research, the challenges of finding the way and the imperative that we have to continue searching for it, especially when it comes to digital platforms, really came to the fore at the committee hearing. We actually had two. We had a follow-up hearing and may have a third. And maybe I'll start with just telling you a little bit about it. As you all are probably familiar, as it originated in the UK, this was really a response to the No Safe Space for Jew Hate 48-hour blackout, which I actually joined on Twitter. I'll say that to me, it wasn't about boycotting Twitter, or not at all. I think that it was really about raising a red flag about the imperative to begin this conversation, or to continue this conversation, and talk about the responsibility and the accountability that we want to hold the digital platforms to. What began as really a response to whether it was the Wiley Twitter or the general atmosphere, I would say, on Twitter specifically, on digital platforms generally, and we, as I will refer to, we invited other digital platforms as well, Facebook, TikTok, were all invited. I'll say that TikTok was a no-show in neither hearing, and we are in an attempt to create a third opportunity for TikTok to engage in discussion, and maybe I'll address the specific challenges that I see with TikTok that we should raise as well, just in terms of the age of the audience that frequents TikTok and is exposed to all kinds of content, hate speech included, and anti-Semitic messaging included. As you know, or I imagine you know, the result of that 48-hour blackout in terms of our hearing addressed, or attempted to address, the challenge of what was clearly anti-Semitic content, but addressed with a very, very major delay of 36 hours, which is like saying forever, on Twitter, and eventually, yes, led to Twitter's engagement with the issue. What was actually more troubling than the original Wiley messages, and I'm not sure if anybody was exposed to this hearing, it did go viral, and it coincided. I don't think it was a coincidence. I mean, it was a coincidence in terms of the date, but the fact that it reverberated so overwhelmingly loud across oceans, or across the ocean, because it really reverberated in the States, it coincided with the hearing that took place in the United States, in fact, with regard to other issues of corporate responsibility. But this too is an issue of corporate responsibility. And so I think it was also just that the stars aligned in terms of us holding the hearing, and that was a coincidence on the same date. What really, and what I'm referring to, if anybody wants to, sort of watch it themselves, it's a very short clip, was indeed Arsen Ostrovsky raising a question as part of the hearing that equated, or asked Twitter to respond to how it was okay that Iran's Khamenei calls for genocide, while, political leadership, and he referred to Trump, which may have also helped, in creating a bit more of or calling a bit more attention to the issue at hand. But I actually insist on depersonalizing this and depoliticizing it, because I think that's a very important point of anybody trying to expose double standards. When he raised the issue to the Twitter representative about those two sort of comparative case studies, let's call them, it was actually Twitter's response that was shocking. And if you watch the exchange, there was a moment where I thought I misheard the answer that the Twitter representative gave us. And so I said, just one second, I just want to fine-tune the question. Calling for genocide is okay, but political commentary by a politician in a certain country is not okay, according to Twitter. That is the policy. And indeed, what was exposed by the Twitter representative's response was, you know, one was seemingly something that was acceptable in one form or another. Saber rattle was the term that was referred to the genocide piece, whereas the other was not. Okay, so I mean, you could watch it. It's a very short clip. I want to say that what's most important, and really, this isn't, again, it's not about Twitter, and it's not about a specific digital platform, and it actually isn't just about hate speech or anti-Semitism online. It's also about the implications of what happens online, offline, and sort of the, I would say that the ripple effect between the on and the offline, and that I believe that in terms of corporate responsibility, we have to bring to the fore as well. And what came out of this discussion, and really the elucidation of it with that question as I described it, was this was a clear case of double standards. It made it very easy to pinpoint the double standards as they were apparent, and there was a conversation to be had, and I believe in a very important conversation to engage with the digital platforms in terms of, the first thing was, what is anti-Semitism? Now, I suggested the adoption of the IRA working definition. It exists. 30+ countries have adopted it. The IRA working definition, and we can discuss it later maybe in the Q&A, complicated as it is, it's important that we understand that the IRA working definition for anti-Semitism, that, as I said, indicated it's a working definition, it's not legally binding, but it has been adopted by tens of countries, and it includes the 3 Ds, the demonization, the delegitimization, and the double standard against the state of Israel. And so it lends itself to this conversation and this engagement. And in order to be able to address the issue, say, of anti-Semitism online, or hate speech more generally online, we first have to define it. I mean, I feel very strongly about it. I'm sure other lawyers in the room do too. We first have to define the issue. So I would say we should be open to an alternate definition, but there is one that exists. And the suggestion of the committee hearing, which I floated to the digital platforms that were at this hearing and at the follow-up hearing, and I'll engage a little bit more with with Facebook specifically after this part of the conversation. The recommendation was to adopt a definition. This definition specifically was one that I recommended, the IRA working definition of anti-Semitism, including the 3 Ds, so that there is clear policy, so that it's transparent, so that it's made clear. And I would say, in addition to that, does not necessarily lead to, and I say this with very, I would say, nuanced understanding of the delicate balance between free speech and the need or the imperative or the wish to regulate hate speech, not so that it'll be either deleted or removed completely, but very possibly as an educational tool. So if we're to hold digital platforms to account for the tremendous power that they hold and for the corporate responsibility that we see them having on and offline, then that tremendous power can come with an additional opportunity, I would say, if they recognize it as such, to educate the public, so that if there are agreed upon definitions, and the technical term was that the Twitter representative used was to click through. So if there is such a mechanism that enables the public to understand that now, if you would like to click through, you will be exposed to certain content, then we can use that technological mechanism that's available to say, this, you should know, meets the IRA working definition of anti-Semitism. You can now click through. There was a very important discussion both on the transparency and on the tools used and the implementation. And I think that the very engagement in the discussion was important. Unfortunately, with regard to Twitter, there was no real follow-up in terms of next steps. Although, again, I think that the discussion in and of itself is important, and the engagement of it in it. I'll say that Facebook came to the next hearing. We had a follow-up hearing as a result of the first one, and Facebook that came to the following hearing is clearly in the midst of a very deep process. Now, that's not to say that they're ready to adopt the IRA definition, including the 3Ds. They're looking at the IRA definition. The 3Ds are very challenging, and I understand where they can be challenging in terms of how do we differentiate criticism of a government from delegitimization of a government. The only point that I would make, and maybe just to give a bit of a tease so that in the questions and answers we can sift through this and maybe give it additional thought with your help, is the question really is, if there is one country in the world that I'm aware of that there are regular calls for genocide of its people, can we say that Israel is the proverbial Jew? And so in that case, if we legitimate the call for genocide on any platform, because it's not a specific person or a specific group or an ethnic minority, it's the call for genocide, which Twitter regards as saber rattle, how do we address that without the 3Ds? Because again, above and beyond the double standard, even if we want to equate, all countries and say, well, it would be okay to call for genocide of any other people in any other country. The fact is, I'm not familiar with any other country that its very right to exist is called into question regularly. And so that's a very tough thing to sort of, in a legal or with legal tools or legal mechanisms, attribute difference to, in terms of how do we differentiate, and I don't want to differentiate the state of Israel from all other states. I want the state of Israel to receive the same standard as all other states. But if there is one exclusionary situation that we see, addressed at one state, then how do we address that? Again, the double standard. So that's a bit of the description of what happened in the two hearings. As a follow-up, we had a very, very good working meeting with Facebook's representative in Israel. And I believe that it intersects with Facebook's process, as I said, that's undergoing, actually related to the hearing that took place in the States, coincidentally on the same day as our hearing, in terms of corporate responsibility and what is Facebook's ability or inability, willingness or unwillingness, and also what is the role of government? What is the role of our governments? And I'll say in this, or to this end, I've actually initiated the formation of an interparliamentary task force that will address this, because it takes a network to beat a network. This is a global issue at this point. And so I think that the more that we can collaborate on this understanding, and it may be that different countries, we know actually as a Canadian, I know that, for example, free speech has different implications in different countries. Certainly, if I compare the States to Canada, clear and present danger is not incitement and fighting words. There are very different boundaries. Nonetheless, there may be a place, and again, this is for discussion, and I look forward to hearing your thoughts as we engage in this process. There's something to be said for the fact that these are global platforms. These are international platforms, and we need to create some sort of unified regulation of, if we are to create some sort of unified regulation. And do we want the platforms regulating, or do we want government taking responsibility and regulating? Mark Zuckerberg has asked government actually to step in and step forward and take responsibility, saying, that would be random. We don't want to give this kind of power to the digital platforms. Is that self-serving? Is that de facto our legal understanding of not wanting an algorithm to decide what is free speech and what isn't, and so forth? I'll just give another maybe moment, a glimpse into TikTok, and where I think we have to, again, in sort of a global effort in engagement in addressing this. TikTok has millions of young users. That means that what young users are exposed to in terms of hate speech generally, anti-Semitic content specifically, is above and beyond everything else. If I say education, then it really becomes our responsibility globally. And at the moment, TikTok has thus far been unwilling to engage in this. I mean, very politely declined, but unwilling to engage nonetheless. And that's a question for us, right, in terms of holding to account. And what does it mean to hold to account? Because part of Twitter's self-defense is, it's actually the public, I mean, this is a little bit irrelevant in Iran, where the public can't have a Twitter account. Nonetheless, part of Twitter's self-defense is it's actually up to the public to engage with the politician at hand and hold them to account. As I said, in Iran, that seems like a little bit of an irrelevant defense, except that in other countries, let's say we would accept it, okay? With regard to TikTok, is that the line of defense? Because we're talking about minors. We're talking about millions of children exposed to hate, exposed to anti-Semitism in this case. And if we I would say this, if we ignore it, then we all face a challenge which all of our children are exposed to. I mean, I don't know how many of you on this call have young kids, but it is where they are. It is the street that they are playing on at the moment. And so I challenge us to think about that as well. The challenges of a digital platform that's unwilling to engage. It's a whole other kettle of fish. I think I want to end here just so we can have more of a discussion, if that's okay, Joshua. And hear more of Q&A and more of an engagement, because I'm sure I could learn so much, both from the questions and also from your thoughts, everybody that's on the call with us this evening.
Thank you, Michal. And I've seen that some questions have been posted in the chat, and I will try and weave those into the Q&A as we go. But first of all, Michal, if we can just begin by unpacking a lot of the ideas and policy suggestions and recent parliamentary history that you just took us on a very, very interesting tour of, especially from the Israeli perspective, almost looking in at the fight against anti-Semitism that's been going on in the UK. And when we're discussing hate speech, we've linked the event to the concept of free speech, and really where I want to start is by looking at where that line is. The UN Human Rights Committee has noted, and I'm quoting from their general comment 34, that at least with regard to comments about public figures, consideration should be given to avoiding penalizing or otherwise rendering unlawful untrue statements that have been published in error but without malice. And in the UK, the European Court of Human Rights requires any intervention restricting free speech to respond to a pressing social need, which must pursue a legitimate aim, be necessary and proportionate. In other words, in the UK, blanket bans on misinformation, even if it is hate speech, are unlikely to be unlawful per se. So what are your views on how we're to draw this line between hate speech and free speech? Do you see malice as the material factor? And how would you see that applying in relevant contexts, such as, for example, Holocaust denial?
Right. So Holocaust denial is also very interesting in terms of Facebook's understanding of it. I'll just say that. And the IRA definition is actually what's going to guide them forward in their implementation of their policy, from my understanding. They're working on that actually through the lens of Holocaust denial. It will be very interesting to see how they implement that and what kind of guidelines and policy they create around that, and even what are the trigger words that they use in order to define Holocaust denial, right? That's part of the technological challenge of translating what we understand as the boundary between hate speech and free speech or Holocaust denial into, you know, the technological implementation of it. And that'll be a very interesting test case. We actually discussed that at length with a Facebook representative, because that could be a case study for how we move forward on other issues as well. I'll say that the question is what the goal, the question for me is what the goal is. So I divided my my discussion with you this evening between law and education. And I think that it's a very important distinction, because sometimes as lawyers, we look for solutions that are strictly legal, and that's why in that conversation and in that engagement, part of what I think we can be asking for in terms of corporate responsibility is actually not the removal of content. The removal of content requires that we be much more legally stringent on understanding where we infringe upon free speech. However, the educational tools available enable us to use I would say an internationally accepted definition, assuming there is one, assuming we accept the IRA definition. There are a lot of assumptions here, and assuming we can make those kinds of understandings of definitions in other contexts as well of hate speech. And as I said, flagging it for educational purposes. So it's far less harsh than the removal of content from the legal perspective. We're not infringing upon free speech. We're actually, in one sense or another, we're increasing the debate or the discussion around whether this is free speech or not, with the ability of, I would say, increasing knowledge, increasing awareness. That's assuming that we can agree upon a definition, which is challenging in and of itself. You know, in all regards, certainly, and we've just mentioned Holocaust denial as one example, which Facebook is really struggling with, and I believe that they've come to some sort of an understanding of where they can refer out. So not Facebook educating, because that would also not be something we want, right? That's very big brotherly. Digital platforms will now offer us all the definition for what it is that we're viewing, whether it's anti-Semitism or Holocaust denial or hate speech. That's not what we want either. The question is, can we find some sort of terminology that we can agree upon that the digital platforms refer us out to? So further reading on Holocaust denial and address us or send us to or click through in whatever way it's done to the information on Holocaust denial. I think it'll be a very interesting case study for us to look at and perhaps learn from with regard to the wider issues that you've raised.
So specifically, then the policy approach that you're suggesting would be designed and tailored to the social media companies in particular. Do you see a difference in approach contingent on the source of the hate speech concern? Because here we have hate speech mediated through social media and a policy response which engages with the media effectively. But are specific, in your view, policy responses required contingent on whether the speech emanates from state-controlled media? For example, the example you gave of Khomeini and the incitement to genocide would be a classic example of state-sponsored hate speech. But you know, if we're talking about an individual who is tweeting hateful content online, but is acting as an individual, arguably a different policy response is required. So do you see a difference between the different actors involved in the problem?
So I think it's a very, very important question to engage in, Joshua. I think, look, in Twitter's case, they actually saw it maybe differently than maybe we would, or you've just expressed, or at least the way that I heard it. Because in their understanding of their policy, it's actually the political leader that needs to be held to less of account in this case Khamenei, because his users will be the one to use him to, or his public will be the ones to hold him to account. Whereas a private individual won't be held to account by anybody. They're just disseminating hate online without being held to account. It's a very interesting differentiation. And again, it opens up a whole array of questions that I think from a legal perspective, we have to look at what is the responsibility that we have, and is this really the marketplace of ideas? So does the public have the ability to hold the leadership to account? Again, in Twitter's case, it became very ironic because there is no public with private access to Twitter in order to be able to hold Khamenei to account, meaning the Ayatollah regime of Iran holds the Iranian public hostage to the very same challenges in terms of double standard that that we're discussing. So it's quite an interesting perspective to look at it from that perspective, except that we can't differentiate between political leadership here and there, or can we? So do Western democratic leaders have different expectation? Do we hold them to different account than, let's say, terror supporting regimes, genocidal regimes? You know, it's an interesting question to engage in. I think the most important thing that we have to become aware of, and for me, again, you know, I'm dating myself a little bit. For me, digital platforms are a foreign world. I get lost in them, as I'm sure my children do. But I think that what guides me in understanding the discussions we should be having in regulating or not regulating, and that is, as you said, the topic of my doctoral dissertation, ironically or not. My doctoral dissertation focuses on regulating or not regulating and the impacts of the attempt to regulate speech on university campuses. Okay, but university campuses are just the platform. They're just the ecosystem. And in the same way, I would argue that digital platforms are just an ecosystem, and we can use the same understanding that we have for, or at least some of the same understanding that we have, and some of the same tools that we have, legally speaking and educationally speaking, for what happens in other ecosystems, offline, off digital platforms, at least in our attempt to either regulate or not regulate, to either demand accountability or not demand accountability, and decide who is accountable. Is it local government? Is it some sort of an international collaboration? Is it the digital platforms themselves? I'm afraid I have more questions than answers on this, but you know, as a true lawyer, I think that we're engaging in and in a place where the law hasn't met up with reality yet. We haven't met up with the challenges of this new reality. This whole thing is 10 years old, and the law is at a bit of a loss. And I think that we have tools to utilize, to implement in our understanding of what happens offline, and we just have to find, or not just, but we have to find, and we have the duty or the responsibility to engage in the discussion on how to implement our understanding offline to this new world of digital platforms that at the moment is the wild, wild west, where there is zero regulation.
And so are the focus of your efforts as a lawmaker in Israel principally going to be geared and directed towards the social media companies, or do you think that there's a more layered game that needs to be played, relying on all of the legal tools at your disposal, including international human rights law, including criminal law, including defamation law, and again, do you see a distinction between the application of these different tools to the source of where the hate speech is coming from? For example, if it's a state actor, then international human rights law will apply, but if it's a private individual, it won't.
So I think, first of all, that's an excellent question, and I think it's a multi-layered game, as you indicated. I think we're really at the brink of, and I'll say, locally speaking, as a lawmaker, I'm looking at the adoption of the IRA definition into Israeli law. We haven't even given it the legally binding definition that it deserves. So I would say, and I would argue, and I will argue, that the state of Israel actually has the role to lead in this effort. And I like to take it away, actually, even from Israel and from anti-Semitism, because I think at the end of the day, when we are able to engage in this discussion, or if we don't engage in this discussion in a way that, especially as we claim to expose double standards, if we can't apply it across the board to all minorities, to all peoples, to all countries, then we undermine the very basic tenet of not applying a double standard. So in that sense, and that's part of why my response is that it's a multi-layered approach. The only thing is I would say that I think that there are local, national elements to it. So the engagement, or the inter-parliamentary engagement in this discussion, and the identification of global challenges as opposed to local challenges, I think will really refine and define for each of our, legislative bodies, their level of involvement and where it's appropriate. In that sense, the global engagement, I don't know that we can have some sort of, I don't know if legislation is the global, is the result of global engagement. I see it more as some sort of a covenantal engagement, or a covenantal agreement between us, because really there's no infrastructure to implement or to enforce any kind of global understanding of this. I really do think that the very engagement of this from an international perspective lends itself both to finding the most effective solutions and tools that we could be using locally and globally, and not always legally. So, a covenant is not a legally binding document. An understanding of the corporate responsibilities of the various companies, of the tremendous power that they hold, and the willingness to take responsibility and be held to account by us, by their users, and by the countries that enable them to access to those users. That's an important discourse that we should be having globally. The local implications are going to have a very nuanced understanding of all of the issues that we've raised, whether it's hate speech or free speech, or an understanding even of what you've asked about. Is it political leadership or is it the individual? That touches upon so much of our own local, national legal infrastructures that we have to take into account, that I'd be foolish to think that we'll be able to do that on a global level at this point.
Just a slight side question, which is, you're talking about a covenant and the suggestion of maybe some kind of soft law or codes of conduct, etc., which could be used in this way. As an Israeli lawmaker, are you tapping into the international projects which are ongoing in this regard, the Ruggie principles on business and human rights? There is a shift towards the encouragement of social media companies to adopt international human rights law-based approaches to these questions. Do you see this as a potential? You mentioned an opportunity. Do you see a potential opportunity for Israel here to integrate what it's doing at the policy level with the international human rights law community in a relationship which has been fractured, to say the least, for many decades now?
So I have to say that once again, the offline-online connection, and part of my, I would say part of my sense of commitment as an Israeli lawmaker, and maybe even a part of my incentive to enter the Israeli Knesset, is actually to touch upon exactly, or to address and advance exactly what you've just asked about. Israel's imperative engagement in the human rights discourse, in international law and human rights, is something that we've, I think, and we can get into the ins and outs and how we came about and how we've arrived at this place. But when I say the lingua franca, the language of human rights, we don't have the privilege not to engage in it. And I don't mean English. When I say we don't speak the language, very often people in Israel say to me, I speak English, and I don't mean English. I mean the language of rights. And so generally in the international arena, by the way, to Israel's detriment. So this is not about, it's not a self-serving need, it's an imperative for the state of Israel to be able to rise from the docket of the accused, as I call it very often, in the international arena. It has to speak the language of rights. It has to engage in the language that its friends and its foes engage in, both on and offline. We don't have the luxury of not knowing these tools, of not utilizing this terminology, of not applying these laws. And so the issues that you raise, I think, are going to be, and I very much hope, I'm not sure if you realize how precarious this government's been over the last 24 hours, but I very much hope to have the time to address those issues at a much broader context, and the issues and the examples that you raise are excellent examples for where I believe the state of Israel has to be a part of the conversation, has to at the very least be familiar with a conversation that's ongoing and engage in the conversation, and I would even argue has a lot to offer in terms of its perspective and its understanding if we speak the language. And so that I'm 100% committed to all of those issues. And in fact, I invite you and everybody on this Zoom call to also raise my awareness, because I have a very certain understanding of international law and the way that we haven't engaged in international forums. I mean, with a pending decision of the ICC and so forth. But certainly in terms of maybe more of economic and certainly technological applications of the human rights discourse, I invite you to absolutely make me more aware of what is ongoing, internationally, and to engage in continued discussion with you and be able to learn from the experience that you have.
The biggest problem, I suppose, as pro-Israel advocates that we encounter with these instruments routinely, is that most of the time pro-Israel advocates find that these instruments are being used as a sword against Israel, and we're in the position of defending against allegations and using other regulations and laws as a shield. Which does lead to one final topic that I wanted to ask you about before just turning to the questions from the floor, which is, when accusations of hate speech are made against pro-Israel advocates, how you think government should in Israel should respond to that? What advice you might give to pro-Israeli civil society in this regard?
So I think, once again, it really touches upon, and you see the sort of the leaching out, the online, offline exchange of ideas. And actually, I'll say that the original hearing that I asked to hold at our committee was based on the understanding of anti-Semitic events, and really the spread of anti-Semitic events, many of which aren't reported on, certainly in the United States and in Canada, I'm sure in the UK as well, and the understanding that the coronavirus challenge brought with it another kind of mutated virus, anti-Semitism, on the streets. It came to the digital platform relevance after the Twitter no safe space for Jew hate, and that's what came to the fore during that discussion. But it actually started with anti-Semitic events off the streets. And in terms of the accusations launched again or against those that, I, for lack of a better word, support Israel, but it's not. To me, it's support of democratic values. It's support of our shared values with all democratic countries. And assuming that we expose the double standard, and assuming that we equip those, and I know that you're in the trenches, and I know that very often you're in the trenches alone. And assuming that we equip those in the trenches with the understanding and the I would say acknowledgement that the state of Israel is doing all that it can in order to rise from the docket of the accused. And that's already my responsibility from within the Knesset. The state of Israel has to take responsibility to begin engaging with whoever is launching the attacks on Israel's supporters, meaning that doesn't mean that I free you all from desisting from the important work that you do. But I think that the state of Israel has to, at the very least, engage at the same level and understand at the same level the challenges that you face. And that conversation is actually one that doesn't disempower those engaged in defending Israel against its. And I would say, again, I don't like use of these words, because, the very use of word defense assumes that we've done something wrong. I think that the engagement with the issues from a place of knowledge, and knowledge is power, enables us, as I said, to empower all those in the front lines with the understanding that the state of Israel can and should rise from the docket of the accused, and that the state of Israel has a large responsibility in order to be able to equip all those on the front lines, and all those that are committed to explaining this, or to, I wouldn't say go on the offense either. It's just to identify with shared values. That is also the state of Israel's responsibility. That's how I see it.
Okay, we'll move to the Q&A. The first question, or the last question here, is the question seems to be, i.e. the question of free speech as against hate speech, seems to be whether the Charybdis of harmful content poses a greater danger than the Scylla of censorship. Do we face a greater danger from a free exchange of ideas, even though harmful ones will seep into it, or let a handful of government officials or tech oligarchs maintain a chokehold over public discourse? The record of university officials in enforcing speech norms does not inspire confidence amongst Jews or supporters of Israel.
So I'll address that just through the case study that, of universities, and say the attempted regulation of speech has actually boomeranged very, very dramatically, certainly in North America. I don't know the situation in the UK as well, but if you're familiar with the speech codes that have really taken over and actually are now, there's a pushback against those speech codes, microaggressions and trigger warnings and no platforming and terminology, even the very fact that there are speech codes in, of all places, an ecosystem that is meant to create a place for the exchange of ideas and not be safe from ideas. We understand the dire effects of the attempt to regulate speech from what we've seen happen at universities over time. So that's where I caution us, I caution myself in terms of regulating speech or attempting to regulate speech. The question is what we do, even if it's soft codes, as we said, or the ability to create some sort of codes of conduct, and I would say knowing that we don't want or at least I don't want the companies to be in charge over regulating speech in that sense as a big brother type of a policeman or an algorithm regulating speech. I'll tell you a little anecdotally. There's an Israeli journalist that regularly around Purim time, when we read the Megillah, there's a mention of the word kush in the Megillah that we read over Purim. So regularly he ends up, every year annually, inevitably, quoting a verse and actually getting kicked off digital platforms regularly over and over because the algorithm identifies the name of a country, which is what it is, in an old script as something that is a racist term, and therefore removes him from use for a month, or bans him from a month from use of every relevant digital platform that he's tried to do this with. And he does it every year, year after year, to sort of test the algorithm. That's just anecdotal. I think the challenge remains. The challenge remains online as it is offline. And the discussion we're engaging in is exactly about creating some sort of regulation or no regulation. Perhaps regulation, as we mentioned, is not the way. Perhaps flagging and using an educational tool in referring users to an accepted definition, assuming we can agree on an accepted definition, is the way that we move forward in expecting digital platforms to take responsibility, not in removing content, but in creating an educational tool that enables users to be informed. And I would answer that question in the same way that we've answered it with regard to, to online, online and offline, sort of. I use those quite interchangeably because I think they raise the same issues in terms of the balance between the conflicting rights and responsibilities. Joshua, I can't hear you.
Sorry, I just unmuted myself. There's a question here about algorithms translating content, and those who are conducting the monitoring not having English as a first language. Due to translation, the statements posted may not be accurate. So what can be done about this problem where content is lost in translation?
Right. So the lost in translation piece, I think, preoccupies the digital platforms tremendously. It's also a cost question, right? And then the question becomes, is that a consideration? So if the imperative is to not get lost in translation, meaning you have to pay they have to pay, or do we hold them to account and demand that they have to pay? Once we stipulate that they have responsibility for that, do we take it the next step and say, well, if you have responsibility, then really the cost benefit of the company is not what should guide us in creating some sort of demand or expectation that this be seen through and not lost in translation. It's an important question because I believe it's one that challenges the companies themselves. How do they minimize the cost and maximize the effect of of their attempted algorithmic understanding? And as much thought that goes into it, I believe that at the end of the day, there's a lot of human contact involved in this, or supervisory contact at the very least. And there's another issue there that I would raise to the fore, and that is the time that takes, right? So long as it's an algorithm, then it's quick. The minute that we bring in that human element, it's a much longer process. What do we do in the interim? Does the content remain online? Does the algorithm remove it? And then, the human element decide if it goes back online or offline? How does that impact our commitment to free speech? There are huge issues here. And I think that the engagement with the digital platforms in this regard actually lends an understanding to the challenges to free speech and I'd say the sensitivities of regulating speech online, because they have immediate effect or they have this long-term effect. I said 36 hours for their Wiley tweet, but that's like an eternity online. 36 hours means it was retweeted in so many different places by millions of users, and at that point, the fact that the content is removed makes very little difference ultimately. So here are issues that 100% come to the fore, and I'm afraid I have more questions than answers.
Okay, thank you, Michal. Well, there's a question now about Iran. It's raised that perhaps Iran's membership of the UN should be questioned, despite considering the body's attitude towards Israel. Whilst you were talking, I just Googled Article 6 of the UN Charter. A member of the United Nations which has persistently violated the principles contained in the present charter may be expelled from the organization by the General Assembly upon the recommendation of the Security Council.
Look, that's where I begin my journey, right? I begin my journey offline. I begin my journey looking at the trustees of human rights, the countries, the institutions, the organizations, the organs that are the trustees of human rights, of international law and human rights, and the imperative to expose the double standard that they themselves, and I'll tell you anecdotally in a moment where I come to this from as well, but that they themselves, by not upholding, protecting, and promoting, essentially undermine. Their very mandate, founded upon these principles, is undermined if we enable the double standard, which is what empowers a continued culture of impunity. Iran is a very important example. And again, I differentiate the Khamenei regime, genocidal terror regime of Iran from the people of Iran. And in fact, when you think about it, when we fall short of the responsibility to protect and the responsibility that we have as trustees of human rights, we fail the people of Iran. So it's a terrific example. And if I may, and this has to do more with my offline involvement and the way that I come to this topic with regard to double standards, my own involvement from a legal perspective before I entered Knesset for the last several years in the international arena, at the UN with its representatives in the need to uphold, promote, and protect consistently as trustees of human rights, international law, and that is the case and cause of Hadar Goldin. I don't know how many people on the call are familiar with the case and cause, but there are currently, and today marks the 6th year since the end of Operation Protective Edge. 6 years have passed. Hadar Goldin and Aron Shaul, 2 deceased soldiers, and 2 Israeli civilians, Avera Mengistu and Hisham Asayed, have been held in Gaza for close to 6 years. The deceased soldiers for 6 years, the civilians for a little bit less, in violation of international law from every single imaginable perspective, and in the case of Hadar Goldin, in a standing violation, a continued standing violation with every day that passes in these 6 years of an international humanitarian ceasefire brokered by the United States and the UN, supported by the EU. And every day that passes, that is not represented by these organizations, that violation, the standing violation of international law, is either met with silence or met with some sort of a rebuke or theoretical statement that the soldiers must be returned for burial in the state of Israel. There is no information about the two civilians. We don't know if they're dead or alive. We don't know if they're receiving medication. They're both mentally ill, and we don't know what's happened to them. None of the organizations, none of the institutions, none of the countries, as they continue supporting the terror regime of Gaza. Again, I differentiate it from the 2 million civilians living in Gaza being held as human shields alongside, the 2 deceased soldiers and 2 civilians. When we fail, our responsibility to protect, uphold, when we fail in that task, we enable a continued culture of impunity. And I would say, and I would argue, and I do argue, that one case, and that's why we've called it the case and cause, the golden case and cause, and we talk about the 2 soldiers and 2 civilians, but this reverberates way beyond the single case and cause. The minute that, and you spoke about Iran, that we enable terror regimes to continue engaging with the rest of the world through the trade and economic lens and not through the human rights lens. That is the power of human rights, and it is the pity when we fail to expose the double standards and insist on our responsibility and to hold to account those in continued violation of those principles.
Michal, we're running short on time. This is 2 questions. It may be all we have time for, and if it is, I apologize to those whose questions haven't been asked. Facebook has lauded its algorithms, which it claims almost 90% of hate speech on its platform is a far higher percentage than its algorithms found only 2 years ago. Some, including advertisers and ex-advertisers, have said that 90% is not good enough. What are your views as a legislator on a 90% success rate, also known as a 10% failure rate?
So, because I've engaged with Facebook on this issue specifically, and I believe that they are at a constant attempt to improve, I would say I'm not satisfied with the 10% failure rate, but I accept that as technology has moved and has developed so much faster than the law or than our ability to regulate or than their ability to implement policy, first to create policy transparently and then implement that policy transparently. As long as there is a forward movement of engagement and willingness and openness to take responsibility, and the moment that I see that openness and intent to take responsibility, these are not easy questions. Look how long it's taking us to give these nuanced answers, and we understand that we're in a global reality, and in each country that may translate differently, and it's a global context in which we're sort of applying some sort of an attempted regulation or attempted code of conduct. As long as we can continue to engage, and I believe in engaging the platforms. I don't believe in, unless there's nobody to engage with, as I indicated, in the case of TikTok for now, we're not engaged. There is zero understanding. With Twitter, we're somewhere else. And I actually think that so long as there is a constant movement and we expose the double standard, we demand the responsibility, and we hold the platforms to account as users, and we have ways of doing that. That 48-hour blackout, as I said, I don't believe in boycotts. I don't think that that's ultimately what's going to change anything. I do believe that we have that responsibility to raise red flags and to hold companies, and certainly, in this sense, corporate responsibility is a huge issue. And as I said, as I indicated, our hearing coincided with exactly a hearing that took place on different issues with regard to corporate responsibilities of the digital platforms. I would rather see us engaging and moving forward in this than, sort of in an accusatory or simple solutions, because we know how nuanced this is and how challenging this is. I believe that holding them to account is what's important, but engaging in the process and allowing the process to take place is no less important.
And then finally, a related issue is that deleted content reappears often quickly. Can you speak to how Israeli legislators are working with software companies in this effort to prevent the material being reposted?
Right. So first of all, I'll say this. We understand that the minute content is up for 36 hours, the fact that it's reposted, it's like a brush fire, right? Once we've reached that stage where it's already out there, where it's already, the fire is blazing, it's going to be very, very difficult to rein it in or to extinguish all of the fire. And there'll always be embers that are left somewhere. And I'll say one more thing that we have to take into account as we consider these issues. And an argument can be made that we'd rather it be on the digital platforms we're on, so that we can attempt to regulate, attempt to use to educate, attempt to have some sort of a code of conduct, than on the dark web, where we are not, where we have zero control. I would say that again, I equate it to what happens off digital platforms and I'd say the following. In that sense, certainly in Israel, we're going to be looking at this, locally in terms of the legislation. But I think it always has to be with an eye of understanding that we can hold the companies to account only for what we actually want them to do. I think that's part of the big discussion. I think that that's what's come up in a lot of the questions. Do we mean it? Do we mean that we want the companies to take full responsibility for this? Do we mean that we want them to remove the content immediately when it's flagged? Who has the responsibility? Is it the public that has to alert the platform, or does the platform decide on its own before the content even appears? Those are very, very difficult questions with very nuanced answers. I'm sorry if I'm, being true to my, legal training, and actually really through the place of having been through this 4-year process with the notion of the attempted regulation of speech and the regulation of speech on university campuses, and the implications on free speech. The implications on free speech, we have to understand, have been tremendous. In the attempted regulation of speech, we can't close our eyes to that. It's not only impeded our or this whole generation's understanding of what free speech looks like, but it has, I think, consequences, or certainly unintended, by the way. The road to hell is paved with good intentions. It has unintended consequences we're still not aware of. And I would argue that what happened on university campuses, those are tomorrow's policymakers, world leaders, leading public figures. And we have to be very, very keenly aware of that and in tune with what happens offline when we look at what happens on digital platforms.
Michal, thank you. That was a fascinating hour, and what I thought might have been principally a legal discussion became more of a discussion of law and education policy together. So that insight, I'm confident to say, is a unique and meaningful one. So thank you for giving it to us. Thank you too to Becca Bertman, your assistant, who helped us so much with the organization of the logistics for today, and to Jonathan and to Caroline, as ever, for organizing. I'll repeat it one more time. UKLFI Charitable Trust does welcome donations to cover its costs and its work, and these are made by going to the website at uklfi.charity.com. Thank you all for joining us. I think we got up to maybe 100 attendees at one point, which is a tremendous effort. Please all enjoy your evenings, and thank you once again, Michal.
And if I can just thank you all for engaging, and I hope to have future opportunities to really continue this discussion. I think it's incredibly important and enriching, and I look forward to future opportunities. And everybody be safe and be well in these strange coronavirus times.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.